Well, I get to have the best part of the entire day. I get to introduce Lilia Shevtsova. And Lilia is an old friend. I think probably most of you, the room is probably full of long-term admirers of Lilia Shevtsova. And I hate to just repeat the official biography, but I am going to tell you a little bit, for those of you who don't know Lilia, about her official background. She chairs the Russian Domestic Politics and Political Institutions program at the Carnegie offices in Washington and Moscow. She joined the Carnegie Endowment after being a deputy director at the Moscow Institute of International... That is a test. So I hope you feel safer now. No, we knew that was going to happen. Anyway, so Lilia was at Moscow Institute of International Economic and Political Studies. She's taught at University of California, Berkeley, Cornell. She's been a fellow here at the Wilson Center. We're very proud of that fact. Obviously, she's published widely. She's been in the media. She has a number of books. I hope many of you have read them, and written them too, maybe. Sorry. I could talk about plagiarism in Russia, but I think I'll leave that, because Lily does not plagiarize. That I can assure you. She also has an affiliation with the Royal Institute of International Affairs, Chatham House in Great Britain. But she's a great colleague, and we have cooperated on a number of projects. What she doesn't really say in her biography, she was one of the Soviet Union's leading specialists on Catholicism in Poland. So she has a very diverse background. But we were co-conspirators on a project that Lilia, Alex Model, and I edited a book on Russia's engagement with the West that came out in 2005. And Angela was involved in it. And the most striking thing about the book is it has shown it had no relationship to reality whatsoever. Everything we said in the book is exactly the opposite of what happened.
True.
So I think that doesn't mean that what she's about to say doesn't have any relationship to reality. That was because of her co-editors, Alex Model and myself. But if you want to actually have fun looking at a book that comes out just at a moment in which the world changed and the book didn't, I recommend that book. So,
thank you. You know why Blair has so much sense of humor? Because he's got a good object, you know? Well, it's a great pleasure. It's a great pleasure, it's fun, and it's a privilege to be here. And I want to tell you, if someone wants to have a really great event, you should invite either Blair or Angela, at least as advisors. Because I've never participated this year at the more dynamic and animated event discussing the funeral. Well, really, it's great. Well, now let me just push my ball already into the area of discussion. And I will start with a reflection on the previous panel, which was great, which was really terrific. Congratulations. My colleagues have been discussing the failure of Russia. They've been trying to answer the question, why? Why all the flowers have gone? Remember, Gail, the famous phrase of Alex Dallin and the title of his article, "Why have the flowers gone?" about the Soviet Union. Andrei Kortunov formatted the question in a different way. Why did we fail to emancipate from the Soviet Union? I've been thinking about this refrain, and I decided to change my current presentation in a bit different way, because now I suggest you to put Russia in Russian failure, in Russian inability to cope with itself in a much more broader social and historical context. And look at Russia in the context of the current world. And look and think, what do you think about this world? Because the world is flat, really flat. And everything in the world has some kind of causality. And the most important word in understanding the world apparently is very difficult for me word in English, interconnectedness. And if you think about interconnectedness, inevitably you'll come to conclusion that Russia's failure is occurring in a very pathetic world. I remember Mort Abramovich, the former president of Carnegie, several years ago, while I was discussing Russia, Putin attacking the Russian leadership as usual, he looked at me and said, you know what? You know, the problem is not only about Russia. The problem is about us as well, because we all, Americans including, we still are coping with the Soviet Union collapse, including Americans. And when one is reading the newspapers, the essays, and especially the most fancy, popular observers, Brzezinski, he's talking about decay of Russia. Walter Laqueur, he wrote a book about decay of Europe. Fukuyama, several recent articles about dysfunctional America. And finally, Neil Ferguson. I haven't read the book. I read the review of the book. And it seems to me that he's writing about the stench of the Western decay. So let's put Russia's miserable, pathetic failure into the general context of the, of the world's and Western civilization, I'm looking for a softer word, interlude, or into the context of the historical pause. There are so many pauses in our development, in the development of Europe, the West, America, Russia, the world. And I remember one of my favorite authors, he's a Marxist, he was a Marxist, Antonio Gramsci, once said, the most dreadful time to live and think in times when the old paradigm is over and the new one has not been formed yet. And this is the pause that we are living in. And now let me switch to my points. I have three, the usual, I like the triads. And the canvas is so broad, and the canvas we are going to discuss today and after this lunch, that I will be using my favorite way of just applying brush strokes to this canvas. And of course, well, it will be a bit impressionistic. So 3 points that I will try to raise and ask you to think about. Firstly, I will try to summarize very crude and very rudely the major geopolitical and civilizational outcomes of the Soviet Union collapse and the end of the previous international paradigm. Secondly, I will try to raise the question about the most disconcerting and the most unhappy trend that we are having in the post-Soviet space. And thirdly, I will be discussing myself, and I will be discussing us and our misperceptions, stereotypes, and delusions, which, it seems to me, are a formidable obstacle on our understanding this historical pause that we are still lingering in. So starting with the geopolitical consequences. On the one hand, yes, we have the end of the evil empire and the end of the Cold War in nuclear confrontation, and irrespectively whether it came before the end of the Soviet Union or after. Well, they came nearly at the same time. And the most breathtaking event, the most evident, apparent event, it's the enlargement of the European Union. This is free Europe and free Baltic states, and the emergence of the first global normative power. I'm talking about the European Union. But on the other hand, when I started to think about other positive or negative consequences, I didn't find any positive consequences. I found only negative, because on the other hand, we have the same international order based on the balance of powers created after the World War II, with a Security Council that is based on the balance of forces that does not exist anymore, and which is a formidable obstacle for decision-making on major key global problems. We have the only superpower left, you know, the name of the superpower, that is trying to escape its normative geopolitical commitments and has found absolutely amazing formula of leading from behind. We have an example of policy. It's called reset policy. Перегрузка. That was absolutely fantastic Russian translation. And one of the actors and the sides of перегрузка, of reset, has openly admitted that it delinks the foreign policy from domestic development. I've tried to ask the specialist on American foreign policy, and it appears that this administration is the first to make a breakthrough, to admit that their foreign policy has no linkage to domestic development in the country that they're leading foreign policy with, and flatly rejected normative dimension. When we are looking at the EU, the situation is even much worse, because apparently it's difficult to find, and this is, Blair, you have such a tremendous sense of humor. This is the topic for you, to write a book about mismatch, about challenges, problems, and the nature of political leadership in Europe. Well, that's a book for a very satirical and ironical person to write. Because comparing with the current echelon of leaders, well, I tried somehow to put Merkel in the brackets, but it's difficult for me to keep her in the brackets. But when you compare, Berlusconi, yes, is gone, but still Sarkozy is on, and the rest, and compared to, yes, to Bush, elder, to Kohl, to Mitterrand, even to Major, the last leaders look as political giants. And in general, you know, when one look at the political picture and look at very often at the discussion of politics, global politics, domestic politics, one reminds, you know, about the developments in the early 20th century, and one returns to a typically Oswald Spengler's atmosphere, where the word frustration, disorientation, disappointment, decay, and the brilliant term by President Jimmy Carter, malaise. And I want to remind you that malaise, in respect of the previous stagnation crisis, disappointment and decay of the 70s, malaise was somehow well, the world has found the exit solution out of this malaise. Through what? Through rejection of the Kissingerian politics based only on interests, and through finding the new paradigm of the foreign policy, and at least in part of the world, through combination of normative dimension and interests, which found its symbolic embodiment in Helsinki I. And in fact, Helsinki I was apparently one of the first powerful, important blow to the world socialist system and to the Soviet Union. Helsinki I. And if the world returns to the idea of Helsinki II and tries to find a new combination, new balance of interests and values, apparently that will be our light in the end of the tunnel, which will make our Russian situation in the post-Soviet space, not that miserable, pathetic, and doomed. Unfortunately, so far when I'm reading analysis, policy papers, especially from, okay, I'm not going to name names, but one could see only one idea, and it's very popular among us in Russia as well. The end of ideology is over, my friends are writing. This is about interests, not values, stupid. Just let's forget about, ideological mantra. Let's be pragmatic, and let's be realists. So the age of new pragmatic realism is on, and the stench of decay is even stronger. Let me jump to the second point that I wanted to raise, the most pathetic, less optimistic. This is the failure of Russia. Of course, the phenomena of failure that has political, existential, psychological connotations and implications is very complicated, because only failure pushes any form of progress. Because the political force, civilization, the society has to fail in responding to the old challenges and new ones in order to think about restructuring itself. But there are failures that are significant because of a different reason. And this reason was so skillfully described, an absolutely fantastic anatomy of failure done by Arnold Toynbee, who coined the phrase suicidal statecraft, because some civilizations that perished, they failed. They knew that they failed, but they had no drive, energy, ambition, courage to respond to the new and old challenges. They perished, starting with Sparta and ending with Ottoman Empire and the Soviet Union. But unfortunately, Russia at the moment and other new independent states in our area, in our former space, are trying to treat failure as the pretext for regeneration of the same failed paradigm. There is only one difference. And I remember what I told Blair here, not in this room, but in another room at Canon in 2009. I was talking about unsustainability of the Russian system. It was for me like a mantra. Now I'm returning to this idea with one huge difference, because in 2009, quite a few people among my colleagues would argue that, yes, but we can do something from the top, gradually, whatever. Now it seems to me in Russia we have nearly national consensus that the system is not sustainable, firstly, that the system cannot be reformed from inside, from the top, secondly, that the system has no perspectives, and people inside do know that. And we already discussed with Angela what our friend has said quite openly. One who is doing this new strategy 2020, advising the government, he told me at the conference that Valerie and Steve were present quite recently, he said, well, that's the only problem is the following. Whether we'll find some exit solution before everything collapses. And then he started to continue, writing memo how to implement the new strategy 2020. So there is understanding of the stench and inevitability within the political establishment. The only thing is that they believe that this Titanic who is looking for its iceberg has a long time until it crashed. And so they will have time to find a boat. And as we know, everything happens just unexpectedly, just like the Soviet Union, despite of the fact that Ambassador Matlock said it had been expected, yes, but nobody was prepared for that. And recently, during the last 20 years, we are absolutely, totally stunned and amazed and shocked by financial crisis of 1988, by new financial crisis of 2008, by Arab Spring, despite of the fact that one could have expected it will happen. So when something happens, and something dramatic, massive, turmoil, civilizational breakthrough, it always happens not according to the plan. And that's why another conclusion of Ambassador Matlock is pretty accurate and pretty relevant for today's Russia and today's world. He said, we should have better had contingency plans in case of collapse. And I say, you should better have contingency plans for Russia's implosion, state breakdown, which will inevitably bring a new collapse of the Russian Federation, which in fact is happening today because we lost North Caucasus. It's not part of the Russian constitutional space. And the presidential vertical is not functioning. Because if the leadership wants to crack down on corruption and cannot use the presidential vertical, it's already the verdict of their effectiveness. If the security services are grabbing the juicy chunks of property, and if nearly all en masse, general prosecutors of the Moscow area are being financed by casinos, and the general prosecutor and the president cannot do anything at all, with the exception of one thing. Let's just, dissolve the matter. That means already the state implosion has started, and the implosion can acquire different forms, not only the spectacular form, but quiet, rotten form, which is much more dangerous. And my third topic, I promised to talk about my own problems. Well, my own problem is that I'm accustomed to paradigms, to perceptions, to stereotypes that I've lived with for the last 20 years, and it's very difficult for me to say, here I was wrong, apparently this is not relevant anymore. Well, it's human psychology. And I continue stubbornly to prove that perhaps, maybe in the future it will prove to be right. But unfortunately, it's not only my problem. This is the problem of the intellectual community that works with global politics, with international relations, with all those who convince us that we need to delink foreign policy and domestic developments. Look at the monument still walking, Henry Kissinger. Well, he will be proving that until the end. And here are several, let's call them stereotypes, old and new, that apparently are becoming an obstacle for our understanding what is happening in Russia, in the post-Soviet space, and obstacle for the Western policy towards Russia. Well, I will give rundown in order to save time. Well, Russians, it's genetically, Russians are not prepared for liberal democratic transformation. It's in their genes, they have proved that. At some moment, at some point, people forgot about it. Now it's being reanimated. Secondly, engagement. We should forget about nasty things, but engagement, this is the most important thing. And engagement, instead of means, is becoming the goal in itself. My co-author, Ambassador Andrew Wood, said, it's an obsolete word. We should forget about this word. It has no substance at all. Thirdly, Putin, I'm reading now pieces on Russia. Putin will be doomed to have reforms. He will do them inevitably because the circumstances force him to start reforms. Come on, why? Why on earth? What will strike him and push him to start reforms? Because, reforms means ability to give away power. And not a single reform in Russia or any other country in the post-Soviet space is possible without, the readiness of the political leadership to compete, to have competition, and to get rid of this monopoly hold on power. But Putin came just for the opposite purpose, in order to have power forever. And Dmitry Medvedev, the most innocent and flamboyant and talkative guy who ever warmed the chair in the Kremlin, explained us, we came for 10, 15 years, and then maybe society will mature. For 10, 15 years they came. Another myth that is being supported even by some of my colleagues, reforms cannot be done, rudely, suddenly, radically. We should not be radicalist. We should do reforms gradually introduce competition, gradually introduce rule of law. But the problem is that all reforms in Russia for the last 20 years have been gradual. And what did they bring? And I'm asking them a question. Can a woman be half pregnant? They don't give me an answer. Then how can rule of law could be introduced gradually? That means we should create some gated communities somewhere, select some people that will live according to the law. or create these gated communities, and allow them inside of them competition. And Walter Laqueur, already in one of his pieces, he reminded me that already the world had this experience of a gradual, selective introduction of rule of law. Anybody remembers? It happened in history. Who knows? Huh? Oh, you see, you don't remember. I didn't remember either until Laqueur wrote about that. It happened in the 19th century in China. And Chinese created special gated Skolkovos communities for foreigners, for Westerners, where they allowed foreigners to introduce private property, rule of law, well, and their, checks and balances system of management. Well, they existed maybe for 10 or 7 years until, the peasants from the outside territories demolished them. And final thing, the cure, the malaise and the cure. Of course, Russia's transformation is our problem. It's our mission. We have to do it without any hope for regime change. And we have to demolish the triad: the personalized power, the control over the power over the property, the marriage, the fusion, and thirdly, the new imperialism, the ambition to have the Eurasian alliance, to have Lukashenko, Yanukovych, and everybody else in the Russian pocket. So we have to do that. But there are two elements, two moments, two factors that are quite new, that have been skillfully used by the Russian elite to self-reproduce, to reproduce the system. First, this is the openness of the boundaries. Andrei Kortunov talked about that. Who is against, let it go. Previous regime, the Soviet regime, survived through repression. Current regime survives through open boundaries. Previous regime survived by ignoring the West, fighting the West. The current regime has found absolutely unique, the guys are smart, unique mechanism of survival, of their own survival, and prolonging the situation of the Russian decay through personal integration into the Western society, personal integration, and keeping the Russia closed from the West. So we have somehow to deal with these new gimmicks, with this new technology of prolongation of decay. And the third thing, that we are ready and we are able to do it, those myths, stereotypes, delusions, that in our opinion maybe explain the situation, but in fact they justify the current status quo, those stereotypes. And this is our mission, the mission of experts, the mission those who are involved, who are engaged, and who care. And I hope that during the next meeting, hosted by Angela Blair, we can report that at least we debunked half of these myths and stereotypes. In any case, if you understand that Russia is not only Russia's challenge, but this is a challenge for the whole world, because can you imagine ever the experience of dealing with a collapsing, degrading nuclear petrostate? It's a totally unique phenomenon, and it could happen pretty fast. Thank you. I've scared you enough, yes?
Okay. Questions? We have time for questions and comments. Are there any questions from the floor, comments? Let me begin, Lilia, by returning to one of your earlier points about values, which I find very interesting because, as you implied, we're at a political moment where we seem to think that the realists have won and values are not all that important, and yet your discussion was totally about a world which existed 20 years ago: Europe, the United States, Russia. There's another world out there that's changing very rapidly, and just to take a country like Brazil, which is becoming a major international player. It's had 2 presidents in a row who were once tortured, for whom democracy isn't an abstract concept. and it's a country which is looking to define its place in the world. Gazprom is opening an office in Brazil. It was announced recently. There's a whole new set of connections on the international scene. We can talk about how BRIC is a totally artificial concept, but it does get at something which we haven't really talked about at all, which is Russia exists in a very different world than existed 20 years ago. And after 2008, there are new winners and new losers. I mean, when you take a look at the fact that the United States is no longer the largest trading partner of a country like Brazil or Chile, that China is, that reflects both the growth of China, but also the reorientation of a number of economies outside of the North Atlantic. How do you see Russia fitting into this broader reconfiguration of the international economy, and what does that process have to say about the future of Russia?
Thank you, Blair, for the question. Russia doesn't fit this new reconfiguration. That's why you nearly answered your own question, because BRIC is something totally artificial. In Russia, the share of the innovative production in its economy is 0.003%. How could we compete with Brazil or India? And at the same time, Russia is one of the most powerful factors, because Russia, being the Security Council member, and being a nuclear power, could be a powerful actor that can push its policy by the threat of breaking China. I would only disagree with you on one thing. I'm not that optimistic about China, and I'm thinking about totally abysmal scenario when finally China will prove that this kind of paradigm of personalized power is not sustainable. And Russia plus China together, that will be a real challenge for the West.
Okay, I think I saw a hand over here. Nope. Right here. Margie. Identify yourself.
Marjorie Mandelstam-Balzer, Georgetown University. Lilia, thank you. I'd like to push you to maybe elaborate a little bit more on what you mean when you say that we have lost the North Caucasus.
Well, I will try to be crude even on the most sophisticated questions. I do believe we lost Northern Caucasus for one reason. First of all, Northern Caucasus and Chechnya, Chechnya, Ramzan Kadyrov's Chechnya, it lives, it functions as the new type of sultanistic repressive regime that does not fit totally the Russian constitution. Of course, they're being paid and donated by Russia, but by showing the example of this very interesting trade-off between Moscow and new sultanistic regime for other countries. So constitutionally, we left them. We lost them constitutionally. Secondly, there is a very popular definition in Russia, half-frozen empire. And this is the question, for the wider and popular debate in Russia. We are not anymore ignoring or, I would say, afraid of this term. And during the debate, at least half of the participants believe that the current Russian Federation is half-frozen empire, and it cannot exist in the current geographical format. And Russia sooner or later will move towards some pattern of the nation state. The problem is, as you know, with Tatarstan and Bashkortostan.
Lilia, we're here looking at 20 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union. You've been talking about Russia, but obviously there are other countries which have emerged from the collapse of the Soviet Union. I wonder if you could say a little bit about how you see Russia in comparison to other states which emerged 20 years ago. Do you see the patterns as common? Do you see, where is Russia different from, how is Russia different from some of the other then newly independent states?
Well, we have quite a few sultanistic, neo-patrimonial regimes. Well, I'm not going to name them all. Just look at Central Asia and Lukashenko. Russia is different, firstly, because Russia still is a nuclear state with expansionist agenda as part of the system survival. Neither Lukashenko nor Karimov nor all other guys hardly have these ambitions. And secondly, Fukuyama is using this term in his new book. I am changing it and I'm using the word Praetorian. Russia has, in fact, Praetorian rule. Security services, for the first time in the Russian history, rule the country, and at the same time they control property. So far, we don't pay attention, to subtleties of the activity. But when they will be forced to defend their fusion with property, apparently they will have to use much more their repressive qualities. And apparently this could be a difference between Russia and Lukashenko.
We have Angela.
Thank you. I just actually want to follow on from what Blair asked you. You spend time in Ukraine. I'd like you to compare what you see happening in Ukraine to what you've been saying about Russia, just to extend the question.
Angela, Ukraine is my weakness, and I'm very much afraid that I could be emotional on Ukraine and too optimistic. So far, well, I was wrong thinking that Ukraine will make it during the previous several years. I was wrong. I was too optimistic. I wanted it so much. But at the same time, Ukraine has something that Russia is lacking. Ukrainian history is different, is much more pluralistic, it's much more Western European and Atlantic oriented. Secondly, Ukraine has fragmentation of the elite class. So elites in the West Ukraine, in the South, in the East, they cannot dominate. The problem is that not a single force in Ukraine can dominate, at least for a longer period of time, so they have to bargain. The elite bargain probably is the salvation. And thirdly, they do understand, even Yanukovych, the Ukrainian Putin, he does understand that independence of the Ukrainian regime and control over Ukrainian property, all these guys, Pinchuk plus, in order to guarantee this, they have to have guarantees against Russia. So that's why they have to move towards Europe. The problem is that they're so stupid. They don't understand that they cannot move towards Europe while backsliding on European values. But sooner or later they will discover that. And Putin and Medvedev will help them to discover that.
We have Will Pomerantz and then Charles King.
Yes, Lily, I just want to follow up on the question of gradualism. If indeed at some point you all of a sudden found yourself at the top of this, if you found yourself at the top of this structure, as what are the immediate actions that you would take or that you could perceive as taking in order to reverse the situation?
Well, I will never find myself, so that's why it's a kind of, this dream that I cannot structure. Not a single leader would ever save the country. That's the major problem. But if I were together with a force that could control the tide which is coming to the fore, let's put it this way, yes? And I can persuade them, my first goal will be not all this blah blah about honest elections, control of something, fight with corruption. My first goal will be the convention of the Учредительное собрание, of the Constitutional Assembly, that has to offer Russia a new constitution based on rule of law and checks and balances, and with weaker powers for the president, because the Russian constitution is much more Tsarist constitution, even than the Stalin's constitution. So constitution will be the first step.
Charles?
Charles King, Georgetown University.
We missed you already.
No. The question I have has to do with sort of mode of analysis in a way. Thank you, as always, for a stimulating presentation. So much of the way Western scholars, I think, approach Russia these days, and we might even say over the last 20 years, has been through what we might call the disillusioned mode, the disappointed mode. But that's odd because we don't say that. We don't approach Ukraine in the same way. We don't approach Azerbaijan in the same way. We don't approach Kazakhstan in the same way. So how would you explain that? Is it a function, as perhaps Archie Brown was suggesting earlier, that there was so much promise in 1989 and 1990 that one can't help but be disappointed with what came after? Or is it a particular Western obsession with trying to analyze or think about Russia as a mirror of ourselves, and then we're quite disappointed when it doesn't come up to that particular kind of standard?
You know, Charles, I've been disappointed as well, being not a Western expert. The problem is that I got rid of my disappointment maybe earlier than some of my colleagues in 1983, after Yeltsin adopted in the way he adopted the Constitution and after shelling of the parliament. Bad parliament, nasty parliament, but still the parliament. But before that, and especially in 1991, I was full of optimism. And I have to agree and admit here, urbi et orbi, that Archie was right about Gorbachev. I was totally wrong, Archie, about Yeltsin. So my hope was with Yeltsin, at least for some period of time. The reasons for disappointment. So then you're asking about the roots of hope. It seems to me hope, mine and your hope, short hope or long hope, firstly is based on belief in a constructive and exit solution, which is good. Secondly, it's belief that the previous patterns could work in Russia, secondly. Thirdly, belief that the Russian elite is rational, thirdly. Fourthly, belief in the good of human nature. And the nature of the Russian political elite and intellectuals during the last 20 years proved that we have better, more Dostoevsky than we read previously.
There's time for one or two final questions. We'll go over here and then Steve Hansen.
Hi, Lilia. I'm Jack Sontag, retired from the State Department. You give us a very gloomy picture of what's ahead. What happens next? In other words, life goes on. The mail has to be delivered, the water comes through the pipes, the electricity continues to run. What happens next? Do you have total fragmentation, or what? In other words, I think, as Landon said, you say A, you have to say B. In other words, what happens after what you've talked about?
Jack, it's great to see you. Well, we are missing you at our meetings. I am in a very uncomfortable and awkward position because I am on this Titanic. I cannot do anything together with my friends. I know that we are looking for this iceberg. I'm yelling, saying that we'll hit it. Well, and even I wish us to hit it, because without hitting the iceberg, we could, linger in this ocean for ages. So I'm not in a position to be very rational. But if I just press my cynical sign and cynical button, I will tell you what I believe. I don't have mathematical or sociological explanation of my belief. But my belief is pretty dominant, among various Moscow and regional circles of people, including liberals, nationalists, left-wingers, and huge part of the Russian political establishment. They are even much more pessimistic than I am, because they say, well, we'll hit sooner than you think. I would believe that, firstly, the system already, after September 24, Putin came to power, returned to power, and they're saying, we are not going to leave. Just forget, we are staying. So that means a benchmark. And that means that the system will accelerate its logic. The cyclic logic is over. Better, worse, it's not for us. The logic has acquired another quality. It becomes arrhythmic. Now you sit calm. You feel that there is some kind of bubble beneath the surface, but you don't know when it will burst, because there are no channels for us to see it. But it will burst. Everybody knows that it will burst. So we have to wait for crisis to hit the country. And the worst possible scenario will be gradual, very long rot. You know, when the political corpse will start simply, you know, one limb will just rot away, another limb will rot away slowly. This is the worst option. Much better option for us, you know, much faster state breakdown, which will create the tide, may create the tide. But the result of all options, gradual rot, gradual stagnation, or some sudden implosion and collapse, all options will have one apparently end solution, end game. Apparently Russia's partial disintegration, and in all cases, even if we liberalize Russia, apparently we'll have a new type of confederation or federation with some associated states, etc. Because, well, this kind of state, especially when we lost 40% of our population in Siberia and the Far East, and we'll have to invite millions of Central Asian people in order just to fill the jobs, it's not sustainable or viable in the longer perspective. And we have to acknowledge the fact. And we have to be prepared for that.
Steve Hansen, I think this will be the last question.
I could cede it because that was actually exactly the question I was going to ask.
Okay.
So.
Is there anyone else who has a question? Ambassador?
Thank you. I was recently thinking about government of Georgia in 1918, when we were independent then. And these guys never believed in kind of independent Georgia. They believed that Georgia had to be part of the bigger international something. Probably Putin never believes in Russia as a state, but believes in something bigger, as he recently elaborated in Eurasian Union. So then the rationale that you have and Russian leadership has are completely different. So they don't believe in Russian state. They just believe in sort of new empire, and that's probably their aim, or not probably, for sure their aim. How you could elaborate these two different visions for the statehood?
Mr. Ambassador, you were lucky, you know, you were lucky, and some other people were lucky. Our friends in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were lucky, because you folks, I don't know how you managed. You got group of the elite that decided that they should put the nation's interests before their own interests, and they will leave power when they're done. So it seems to me that the Soviet common our history did not spoil you. With respect to this disparity between, you know, Putin's belief, God knows, I don't know whether he believes in something or not, but I do believe that even if he has no vision, strategy for Russia, he has one feeling definitely, and this feeling could be called fear, desperate fear, apprehension, and not provoked by Mubarak in the cage, not only by that, but apparently by knowledge of the dwindling potential of the Russian economy, by the declining resources of the Russian budget, and his fear, their fear. And apprehension could be reflected in one very naked fact. Russian budget for 2012, when major part of the budget, more than 35% officially, and according to our independent estimates, up to 50% of the budget will be directed in order to support the repressive mechanism. Military pensioners, MVD, the security services, the new gear, and etc. And the leadership that in time of trouble, in time of decay, talking about modernization, innovation, etc., is spending most part of its budget for repressive mechanism. It says a lot about this elite and its feelings.
Lilia, I'm going to ask one final question, which I've asked you before, so it won't come as a surprise. But
About the book, our book.
No, not about our book at all. You've used images. You've talked about looking for the iceberg. You've talked about the bubble coming up under the ship. These images remind me perhaps of a different one, of a whale. And the obsession with the whale blinding people to the reality that's actually taking place all around it. And the reality of a Russia that has profoundly changed in how people live their daily lives. And a Russia in which, I'm not talking about whether they're Democrats, what their values are, but Russians under 25 live differently from the way you live. And Russians outside of Moscow live differently than the way you live. And one of the differences is they're not quite as obsessed with the whale of political change. And so you have a kind of postmodern society with a pre-modern political system, and obviously somehow those two components need to come together. But the question I've asked you before, what about the rest of Russia that is moving on as if everything is fine and getting on with its life and changing and transforming? What do you see the prospects for that Russia?
Yes, sometimes you are absolutely right. You are playing always a devil's advocate role. We need to do a book again, Angela. Between political trends and the life of the ordinary person is a huge distance. And sometimes the ordinary person is getting involved into the political trend only in the situation of despair. At the moment, Russians do survive. But it's very interesting how they do survive. Do you trust Levada polls? Well, we don't have another instrument. So 50% of Russians are saying, trudno жить, difficult, we are living in a very difficult life. But still, we can cope, 50%. Only 11% say that we've succeeded, we are fine, we can buy refrigerators, etc. 50% already have problems with buying refrigerator. 38% of Russians consider that Russia is going in the wrong direction. And only 21% of Russians say there will be turmoil, and 25% say we'll take to the street. Well, not a large number of people, but 25%, it means 25 million of people. So far, people do survive. But the stability is based now not on hope, but much more on hopelessness. And I'm not sure that the budget and the state and the government will have resources to keep the hope, at least on the minimal level. At least our economists and the official economists and the independent economists are saying, well, 1-2 years. And the official economists who are saying that I am an optimist saying, after 2014, it will go to pieces. So this is the view of the economic elite that deals with numbers.
Lily, I want to thank you. I remember a time when you were an optimist.
Oh, yeah.
And I hope that the world will change in such a way that you can be an optimist again. And when you are, that we'll have you back for an optimistic look at the future. Thank you very much.